Our first part of Section 10 covered the disasters of the 14th and early 15th century. These disasters forced serious changes to the social order that organized prior medieval centuries, especially in Latin Christendom. Now we must flip to the other side of the end of the Middle Ages, the cultural trends that we call humanism or the Renaissance. Here in podcast 10b, we look closer at the specific social and political context that launched the new trend in Italy, in Byzantium, and in nearby lands. First, though, some basic definitions of the terms humanism and the Renaissance. Humanism comes from the Latin humanitas, which means something like humaneness. Humanism means a culture that values human experience and achievement in the present world and strives to improve human life and virtue to make people better in their basic character. How? Well, by reading excellent poetry and literature, by appreciating good art and music, by studying philosophy, religion, and history. The basic idea was that broad learning would make people more knowledgeable, more compassionate, more civilized, in some sense more human. The term Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. That is, the rebirth of culture and learning. The term Renaissance was not actually used until the 19th century. In fact, the term medieval comes into use then too. But the word is based on a general idea from the 15th century that somewhere in the distant past could be found an era of great wisdom and beauty. Specifically, in this case, the classical world, the world of ancient Greece and Rome. Somehow the word implies this golden age had declined into a period of darkness. But thanks to human effort, a golden age could be revived, supposedly, and even surpassed. The Renaissance, humanism, were fused together as trends because it was the literature and art of ancient Greece and Rome that served as a model of virtue and beauty for many in the 15th century. But in a real sense, the Renaissance was a way to talk about the past, this basic storyline of decline then revival. You've probably noticed that this basic idea still casts a shadow over history courses like this one. We have to consciously step back in order to resist its pull and look at the cultural trend of humanism in wider context. To understand the rise of Christian humanism or the Renaissance, we start with some specific political context. We noted the disasters of the 14th century. We noted the rise through that era of more centralized kingdoms. We should also note that the kingdoms of Christendom were increasingly linked, not just by merchants, but by family ties. The usual medieval game of marriage alliances had created, by the 15th century, a web of family links that crisscrossed much of Europe. But it was not among the centralizing kingdoms that the Renaissance took form. It was one of the few regions that lacked a centralizing king, northern Italy. Since the 12th century, Italy had hosted numerous independent cities, as we've noted. Over 2 centuries, the number of those independent cities shrank. But in the mid-15th century, more than a dozen still competed for land and wealth here. The big ones included Venice and Genoa, both of which ruled webs of islands and coastal outposts in the Mediterranean and Black Seas. They also included Milan, the main cloth center of the region, and Florence, famous for banking. And they included the papal state of Rome, a bit of land ruled directly by the Pope, where the Pope was also the king. These towns feuded over territory, and they struck treaties and traded. In any case, these were the biggest and richest cities in Christendom. Italy was thus different from other Latin Christian areas. Here was a world of city governments, some of which were monarchies, but some republics. These were also states in which the dominant class included not just big landowning lords, but also big cloth merchants, bankers, and the like. Above all, here was a density of wealth and town-dwelling people not found in the rest of Latin Christendom. The denser population, large number of towns, power of merchants, and independent city republics all had an effect. They made Italians feel like members of city communities. Italians were different from the medieval stereotype, and they knew it. They were thus ready to seek ways to distinguish themselves and to show how sophisticated they were. But how unusual was this pattern of political and economic life in Italy? To understand why Italy hosted the humanist movement, we need to look more widely at the Mediterranean, both Christian and Islamic. The most important Islamic state in 1400 was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Here the successors to Saladin had created a stable system that survived the worst disasters intact. Cairo was still the biggest city in probably the entire Mediterranean region at this point. The Abbasid caliphs still lived there. Sultans ruled all of Egypt and most of Syria and Palestine directly. That sultan controlled a web of trade then that reached across the Mediterranean and across the Indian Ocean. We'll talk more about those distant connections next week. Egypt was still a major maker of cotton and paper, a major banking center, and a center of learning for the whole Islamic world. The Sultan still had the best trained army in the region, a large army staffed by former slaves. In fact, quite often the Sultan himself in Egypt was a former slave who had risen through the soldiery. But Egypt was not long to remain the default center of Islamic wealth and power. The 14th and 15th centuries saw the rise of a new key Islamic power based in Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks were initially just a group of Turkish nomads who lived in western Anatolia on the borderlands of the Byzantine Empire. This group was led by a man named Osman, hence the name Ottoman. In the early 14th century, the group was nothing special. It was one of several semi-nomadic herder and warrior groups in the Islamic world that controlled a bit of land. But they had the luck of living close to the still Christian Byzantine Empire, and they could claim that their efforts against the Byzantines to claim land was the latest form of anti-Christian jihad. After Osman died in 1326, the Ottomans continued their raids and began capturing a few major towns. Bursa was their first big conquest and first capital. The leaders then made a decision to do what the Mongols never quite did, fully abandon their nomadic life to form a more stable state based in the old Byzantine city of Bursa. Over 30 years, as disasters of the 14th century hit their peak, the Ottoman Turks continued growing their territory, and the Sultan grew his army until he had taken over about half of Anatolia and had begun to take over some land in the Balkans. Now this was mixed land in terms of religion. There were Muslims here, but there were also Jews, and the majority was certainly Christian. In most respects, Ottoman leaders acted toward the conquered like other Muslim conquerors. They extended the second-class citizen rights to Jews and Christians, as was custom. But in the later 14th century, the Ottoman Sultan made one key exception. He started allowing his conquerors, to enslave a small portion of the conquered community as booty, even if those communities had given in, and to use the slaves to help staff a portion of his army, and later his bureaucracy too. This allowed the Ottomans to quickly and cheaply assemble their sizable army and sizable government using the resources that they were taking over, the people. Ottoman conquests continued throughout the late 14th and into the 15th century, bit by bit. There were some reversals, but generally the process was continuous. They took over lands from Islamic communities, and they took over Christian-run lands. The biggest push came in the 1380s as Sultan Bayezid conquered most of the Balkans. A combined Christian force of Albanians, Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians gathered to oppose the Ottomans, but the Christians suffered a major defeat in 1389 at the First Battle of Kosovo, at which point it was clear who now ran the southern Balkans. Part of the secret to Ottomans' military success lay in their military system. They had some mounted warriors and some ordinary foot soldiers. But they also had a special corps of soldiers called the Janissaries, which worked with a relatively new set of weapons, new at least for the West, gunpowder weapons. The first cannons and handheld muskets. These were crude weapons, they were inaccurate, they were quite dangerous to those doing the shooting. This is partly why the work was assigned to slave soldiers, former slave soldiers, people who had been recruited through the Ottomans' new slave system. But the Janissaries figured out how to control these weapons better than others in the region and put them to good use. The results were stark. The gun-wielding Janissaries cut down army after army of Christian knights and other kinds of warriors, as we'll see. Ottoman conquest continued until by the early 1400s the whole of the southern Balkans and Anatolia was under their sway. Most of the Black Sea would eventually fall to their control as well. By this point, the Byzantine Empire was reduced to a few scattered bits of land, including Constantinople and parts of southern Greece. The Byzantines hung on for 50 more years, in part by paying huge amounts of tribute, and in part by allying themselves with the now dominant Ottomans. But clearly, the Byzantine power was waning. Still, these last decades of the Byzantine state were culturally important. Byzantium had not been a major power for a while, not really since the Fourth Crusade of 1204. Most Byzantine territory had been lost, spun off as other Christian states, such as the Bulgarian Empire and Serbian empires to the north. Constantinople was no longer so big a trading center. It wasn't that large a city anymore either. But it still was a center of learning for the Eastern Church. And still it hosted a bunch of scholars who combed the past in search of practical answers, how to run their small state in a difficult situation, how to persevere, and perhaps most strikingly, how to win support from the wider Christian community. In this time of supposed decline, Byzantine scholars took renewed interest in their distant past. This was the last direct heir of the Roman Empire, after all, and scholars, like George Gemistos Plethon, played up the point, examining Roman history in search of models, and playing up this Roman legacy to win backing from other Christian communities. At the same time, scholars also drew on the pre-Roman Greek past, including Greek literature and Greek philosophy. And the Byzantines played up their link to this Greek past as well. That is, Byzantines of the 15th century talked about themselves as both Romans and Greeks. This interest in the Greek and Roman past was key to Byzantine efforts to win some backing, to convince Catholic leaders in the West that they were all part of the same Christian community, at least enough to help again fight the Muslim warriors. The effort worked in a sense. Byzantine scholars, bishops, and diplomats met repeatedly with Italian and German leaders, and they struck a chord. In the 1390s and the 1430s, various Western Christian soldiers tried to launch new crusades against the Ottomans. In the 1430s, church leaders tried to negotiate a reunion of the Eastern and Western churches. They even struck a deal based in part on this sense of shared Roman heritage and religion. It all came to naught. The Latin Christian warriors were beaten back by Ottoman guns, in some cases slaughtered wholesale. The church reunion ultimately fell apart, opposed as it was by many local religious leaders in Byzantium and nearby in the Balkans. Ultimately, the walls of Constantinople could not hold back the Ottoman army forever. In 1451, Ottomans blockaded the Bosphorus Strait to prepare for a final conquest of the Byzantine capital. In 1453, they captured the city, and the medieval Roman Empire came to an end. But not before it had planted some intriguing cultural seeds in Italy, as we'll see. One other piece of context is needed to place the humanist movement in Italy, the workings of gender and family life in the 15th century. In some ways, the basics of gender and family remained familiar from the early Middle Ages. Christian societies were still, in theory, monogamous. In theory, Islamic societies were polygamous. Women in Christian societies tended to have fewer property rights than women in Islamic societies. It was easier to divorce and leave marriage in an Islamic society, both for women and men. But Christian men and women could escape marriage altogether if they were willing to go celibate and able to get support from their families to join monasteries. But each region of the Mediterranean had its quirks. Northern Europe tended to grant women a more prominent place in public life than Southern Europe. It also tended to push men to marry in their late teens or young 20s and marry women of about the same age, at which point adult children in the north operated more or less outside their parents' control. By contrast, Italy was a more patriarchal and more devoted to an ongoing family unity. The old patterns from Roman law here still held sway. The eldest male of the family made most familial decisions, contracting marriages of his children and then later siblings. Men were usually in their 20s or near 30 when they married. Women in Italy were much younger, in their teens. Familial ties mattered deeply. Families worked in Italy to secure their wealth as much as possible and to secure their reputation by getting their children into key positions in monasteries, in the clergy, or in city-level government. In this sense, Italy had a lot in common with Byzantine tradition. Italy was not the only place, then, that claimed a denser population or hosted small, proudly independent cities. Constantinople, as long as it lasted, was also a similar situation. Italy was not the only place that boasted a growing class of bureaucrats, bankers, craftsmen, and merchants. It was not the only place that featured a deeply patriarchal family life, in which worldly gain in reputation and wealth was highly valued. But Italy hosted all of these trends in one place. Scholars have good reason to see northern Italy, then, as a likely place to experience deeper cultural change.